The Real Meaning of Plotinus's Intelligible World by A. H. Armstrong. The title of this paper is arrogant to the point of impertinence, and also ambiguous. But the appearance of arrogance is unavoidable, and the ambiguity is deliberate. It must seem positively impertinent for a minor historian of philosophy to claim to expound the real meaning of a complex and difficult part of the teaching of one of the world's greatest philosophers. But after all, what else is a historian of philosophy for? To continue forever recording the opinions of others and suspending or concealing his own judgment will help nobody, and will not advance the study to which he has devoted himself. Some day, after due study and preparation, he ought to commit himself to declaring that he has arrived at the truth about certain things, if he really thinks that he has done so, even if he knows very well that on the whole the probabilities are that in a generation or so his views will be forgotten, or only so far remembered as to be listed along with innumerable other indiscretions of the past in some exhaustingly complete PhD thesis. But of course, real meaning is ambiguous. It can mean either the meaning intended by the philosopher whom we are expounding, or the truth on which that philosopher's mind was bearing when he thought, even though he was not fully aware of it, and expressed it in inadequate or misleading conceptual terms. My own belief is that the relationship of the thought of the great Greek philosophers to the Philosophia Perennis can best be expressed by saying that again and again they saw the truth but conceptualized it wrongly and used the wrong language about it. By Philosophia Perennis here I mean, of course, not a particular historical tradition or system, but the one universally true metaphysic, to a grasp of the principles of which we believe the great Catholic philosophers to have attained. This seems to me preeminently true of Plotinus, whose philosophy, more than that of any other of the great Greeks, is what, following Dom Iltyd Trethowen, I hold that all metaphysics ought to be, an analysis of experience. The attempt to discover what is the truth on which Plotinus's mind is bearing behind his sometimes erroneous conceptualizations is one which can, according to my own experience, greatly enrich our own understanding of that truth. So in this paper, I shall try first to give a sketch, there will be no time for more, of what Plotinus thought he meant by his doctrine of the intelligible world, to explain it in terms of his own system, and then some brief indications of what I think to be its real meaning in the other sense, the truth which underlies his account. 1. The intelligible world in Plotinus's system is the second hypostasis, proceeding directly from the first principle, the one beyond being. Plotinus sometimes speaks of it as the one being, the one which is, as opposed to the one which transcends being, but his most usual name for it is nous, intellect or spirit. It is intelligence as well as intelligible, thought and object of thought forming an indissoluble unity. As intelligible, it is the Platonic world of forms, which is both the informing content of the divine intellect and is generated by it in its movement of return in contemplation upon the one. More will be said about this later. The influence of Aristotle's psychology upon Plotinus's thought at this point is obvious. The history of the Platonic forms or ideas merits the attention of the philosopher. In Plato himself, they form a single ordered world or system contained in and in some sense caused by the supreme form of the good, but they are not represented as thoughts of God. It was the Middle Platonists, under the influence of Aristotle's psychology and some curious Platonizing Stoic speculations, who first represented them in this way, and from them the doctrine passed to the Christian fathers and eventually into medieval philosophy. But between the simple statement of the Middle Platonists and the developed scholastic doctrine of the ideas, there intervene the at first sight rather disconcerting speculations of Plotinus. He refuses to place the ideas in his supreme principle, the one, which undoubtedly corresponds in his thought to what we mean by God, because he sees more clearly than any previous Greek thinker the great truth of the divine simplicity and unity. And it seems to him that the multiplicity of the ideas must conflict with that simplicity. So he places the divine intellect which contains and is the ideas on the second level of reality, subordinated to the one. Plotinus here has stated a real and serious problem, that of reconciling the multiplicity of the ideas with the divine simplicity. Catholic thinkers have been unable to accept his solution in terms of descending degrees of divinity, though there are a few Christian philosophers, from Origen onwards, who have adopted something very like it. They have insisted that God is being and intellect, have only used the phrase beyond being with very careful safeguards against misunderstanding, and have applied to God much of what Plotinus says about his second hypostasis, the divine intellect. But a glance at the discussion of the ideas in St. Thomas or St. Bonaventure will show that we have something very much more than a mere reaction from Plotinus to the Middle Platonists. The doctrine of ideas is stated in a way which safeguards the divine simplicity, and this means that the ideas no longer form an ordered world of distinct realities, as they do in Plato and Plotinus himself. The many ideas are one thing, the divine being. This seems to me to mean that the language of ideas is being used, like all our language about God, analogically. It is the best way available to us of expressing the divine plenitude, in which every particular perfection of created beings is found in a transcendent degree in the single divine perfection. This brings the scholastic doctrine very close to that of Plotinus, for Plotinus at least once admits that the one possesses a sort of superintellection, hypernoesis, 6:8-17, and this must mean, at least by implication, that all that is in the divine intellect is in the one eminenter. But it raises a further question for us. From what do we draw the analogy? For Plotinus, of course, the answer is simple. He goes from his second divinity, the divine intellect, to the final transcendence of the one. In the second part of this paper, I shall try to suggest the answer we ought to give. The intelligible world in Plotinus, at once divine intellect and world of forms, is not, like the one, a reality which transcends human experience. In his normal thought, at least, we at our highest are divine intellect. Our forms, existing eternally in the unity and diversity of the world of forms, are our true selves. The conviction that the human intellect is everlasting and divine in an inferior degree by right of nature is, of course, common to all pagan Platonists. This leads on to a very important difference between Plotinus's world of forms and Plato's. In Plotinus's, there are forms of individuals. This at once makes Plotinus's intelligible world and our own intellection far less abstract than they are in Plato. Plato and Aristotle are concerned first and foremost with scientific reasoning, which attains by abstraction to and operates with universals, generic or specific. In Plotinus, we reach the intelligible world by a process not of abstraction, but of intensified contemplation, and the world which we reach is not one of lifeless and abstract universals, but a world of the highest vitality and variety in which every individual is present in all the distinctness of its particular perfection, but all one and all alive and intelligent. The vitality of Plotinus's intelligible world and the particular sort of unity which is to be found there are among its most important and interesting characteristics. Everything there, including forms of inanimate things and irrational animals, is alive and intelligent simply because it is the divine intellect, of its very substance, and not, as in the case of our ideas derived from sense perception, something which has come into it from an external source. This is the full meaning of Plotinus's well-known principle that the intelligibles are not outside the intelligence. And not only is every form alive and intelligent, but it is, in a very real sense, the divine intellect. Because we are in a world of pure intelligence without spatial or quantitative limitations, the part is not a part in any sense which excludes it from being also the whole. Plotinus has the clearest and strongest sense of the difference between spiritual and material being of all the ancient philosophers, and it shows itself particularly in his insistence that we must not think quantitatively about the intelligible world or apply quantitative notions of whole and part to its unity and diversity. A particular intellect is not a piece of the divine intellect, or a particular form a measurable area of the world of forms. Every intelligence in the intelligible world, and everything there, is intelligence, existing as it does in a complete unity of thought, an object of thought thinks, and so, according to the principles of Aristotle's psychology, is the whole. This clear statement by Plotinus of a kind of unity, which we may call noetic or spiritual, distinct from and irreducible to the divine unity or substantial unity, or any sort of material spatio-temporal unity, seems to me a contribution of the greatest importance to philosophy and theology. In the form in which we find it in Plotinus, it means, of course, that each and every one of us really is, at his highest, the whole divine intellect, though retaining to the full his proper personality and distinctness from the other form intelligences. This is the real meaning of the so-called pantheistic passages in Plotinus. For example, you have become all, and yet you were all before. But because something else, other than the all, attached itself to you, you became less by the addition. 6, 5, 12. We can now see that they do not imply any sort of destruction of the personality or absorption of it into an undifferentiated higher unity. The unity in diversity of the intelligible world, the highest level of reality which human experience, short of ecstasy, can attain, proceeds from the transcendent one beyond being and diversity. The way in which it does so, according to Plotinus, is of great interest. The divine intellect is timelessly emanated or radiated from the one, as a potency, and timelessly returns upon it in contemplation, and is actualized and informed by that return. But even the divine intellect cannot grasp the one in its unity without leaving itself behind an ecstasy. As long as it remains in its proper activity of intellectual contemplation, it can only receive the one in plurality. So in its intellection, the one becomes the one being, the unity in diversity of the world of forms. This doctrine that intellect at its highest must represent the fullness of the divine simplicity as a plurality, knowing all the time that the representation is not adequate, seems again a contribution of great importance to the tradition by Plotinus, and its presence in his account of the generation of the ideas strongly confirms the suggestion made above that an analogical presentation of the doctrine of ideas is not alien to his thought. 2. We may now turn to consider the real meaning of Plotinus' thought about the intelligible world in the other sense, that is, to interpret it no longer in terms of his own system, but in terms of the Philosophia Perennis. Plotinus sees reality as a static, eternal order, proceeding in descending degrees of divinity from its first principle, the One. We have no room in our thought for degrees of divinity, and for us reality is simply being and beings, God and creatures. Therefore, if Plotinus, when he speaks about his intelligible world, is saying anything true and valuable about reality at all, and I for one am firmly convinced that he is, he must really be speaking about God and creatures and our experience of them. We must always remember that Plotinus' thought is double-sided. It is an account both of the procession of all things from the one and of our spirit's return thither. Now, I have indicated in this paper and tried to show more fully elsewhere that it is only when Plotinus is speaking about the one that he is really directly speaking about God. We must therefore say that when he is speaking of the intelligible world and of our intellectual experience, using intellectual in the Platonic sense of contemplative intuition, not discursive ratiocination, he is, in some sense, speaking about creatures and our experience of them. I would like to suggest quite simply that we enter the intelligible world and ourselves become nous, when and insofar as we contemplate, that is, know intuitively and love creatures in their being, as created participations or images of the being of God. There are two ways in which we can regard and deal with created things and persons, and indeed ourselves. We can think of them and treat them as raw material for exploitation, means for us to use for our individual and corporate self-preservation or self-satisfaction, or we can contemplate and love and handle them as they are in themselves, that is, as showing us in created images the eternal divine being, which is goodness, truth, and beauty, the creative ideas which are one thing, God himself. It is surely in creatures contemplated like this that we find the starting point for our analogical use of the language of ideas about God. We should note that we cannot contemplate things in their being, things as they really are, without seeing them as created images or participations of God, simply because that is what they really are. And our awareness of things as images implies an obscure but direct awareness of God in the background as other than his images. This is our safeguard against the atrophy of our spiritual life by stopping at created things in some sort of humanistic idolatry. These two ways of approach to creatures, one of which leads through them to God, seem to me to correspond to here and there, the worlds of our ordinary or psychic and our noetic experience in the Platonism of Plotinus. As we have seen, the intelligible world of Plotinus is not an abstract world, a world of abstractions, and it is, as he repeatedly insists, to be found not far away, but within us. And in loving contemplation of creatures, we find ourselves in that sort of unity which characterizes Platonian intellection, becoming each and everything in contemplating it while still remaining ourselves. This becomes, of course, far more apparent and develops much further on the level of our supernatural life as we move towards the perfect unity of the eternal image, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. But we should be aware that we have in our transposition of Plotinus into Christian terms gone a long way beyond him in one most important respect. we have finally abolished the spiritual world. Naturally, this does not mean that we have ceased to believe that God is spirit or that there exists a world of created pure spirits, the angels, who are important to our spiritual life. But it means that we have got rid of the idea, which has haunted Christian thought from the early centuries of the Church with unfortunate results, that man rightfully belongs to a purely spiritual, angelic, or ethereal world higher than that in which he finds himself here and now, and that it is only when he has attained to an angelic or quasi-angelic mode of existence that he can really find God. The intelligible world, as here interpreted, is to be found in this very world of the senses in which we find ourselves, and we can enter it not as pure spirits, but as spiritualized, thinking and perceiving bodies. And furthermore, we have got rid of the spiritual world in the only way in which it can legitimately be got rid of, while preserving everything of value in the Christian Platonist tradition. We still insist that there is a spirituality in things, to the contemplation of which we must in spirit penetrate, purifying ourselves as far as the duties of our state of life and charity to our neighbors will permit, of all earthly concern with things as material, to be exploited for our self-preservation or self-satisfaction. In this way, we justify the insistence on the absolute primacy of spirit or intellect and the other worldly asceticism which goes with it, which we find in the teaching of the great Platonist fathers, St. Augustine or the Cappadocians. But we also insist that this attainment of the spiritual realm in which we contemplate God in his created images is a penetration deeper into this very world of sense experience in which we find ourselves, and not an ascent to another. And so we safeguard that insistence on the wholeness of man as a unity of soul and body, and not just a spirit residing in a body, which is the most important contribution of Christian Aristotelianism and the indispensable philosophical foundation for a full and right understanding and acceptance of the economy of the Incarnation and the sacraments and the visible Church. There has appeared again and again in the history of Catholic thought a tension between what we may, with all due reservations, call the Platonic outlook on things and the incarnational or sacramental. The Platonist, with his attention concentrated on the ascent to God as spirit to spirit, is inclined to feel rather uncomfortable in the sacramental economy. As a Catholic, he accepts it obediently, but he finds it difficult to see why it is not only necessary, but also good and desirable. On the other hand, there is a tendency, especially in our own times, for the sacramentalist to be impatient with Catholic Platonism, and even to dismiss it as the unfortunate result of the influence on the early Church of a way of thinking which was never really compatible with Christianity. He tends to settle down into a naive to this worldly Christian humanism, and to insist on the unity of soul and body in a way which, at least in practice, denies the absolute primacy of the intellect. But the Platonic tradition cannot be dismissed so offhandedly. It is an inseparable part of the tradition of Catholic thought and life, apparent not only in the teaching of the Fathers, doctors, including St. Thomas himself, and mystics, but in the liturgy itself, the supreme expression of Christian sacramentalism. Here are two passages to illustrate this. First, the post-communion for the second Sunday of Advent. We humbly beseech thee, O Lord, that by the participation of this mystery, thou wouldst teach us to despise the things of earth and love those of heaven. And still more striking, from the blessing of the oil and balm for the chrism on Maundy Thursday, that whosoever shall be outwardly anointed therewith may be so inwardly anointed that being freed from all contamination of bodily matter, omnibus sordibus corporalis materiae carens, he may rejoice in being made partaker of the kingdom of heaven. You cannot separate Platonism and sacramentalism there. If our minds are to be set free from what can be a very distressing tension, we must find a satisfactory way of reconciling these two tendencies. The present paper is put forward as a personal reconciliation, perhaps more satisfying to myself than it will ever be to anyone else. I believe it to be in accordance with the essentials of St. Thomas's thought, but I have had to reach it by my own rather unorthodox route as a Catholic historian of philosophy faced with the necessity of coming to a settlement with the powerful and attractive thought of Plotinus, which so often attains the truth and is so often again profoundly unchristian and anti-Christian. All my thinking has been done in the light of what little I know of the Fathers, especially St. Augustine. I have been greatly helped on the way by Dom Mark Pontifex and Dom Iltyd Trithawen, and by the books of Père de Lubac and Père Bouillet, as several passages in the paper show. But the conclusion I have reached and the peculiar mental processes by which I have arrived at it are my own, and the distinguished philosophers and theologians just mentioned should not be blamed for them.